The desert was a blast furnace. Heat shimmered off the scorched earth of central Tunisia as the massive P-47 Thunderbolt tore through the sky. Inside the cramped cockpit, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds gripped the control stick, his gloved fingers white against the metal. He was 19 years old, his face tight with adrenaline and slick with North African dust. His heart hammered, a brutal rhythm against the roar of the engines. Below him, the war was a savage geometry of death. Waves of scorched tin stretched out, broken only by the cold, malignant gleam of German armor. Dozens of panzers, an unstoppable iron tide, were grinding relentlessly toward a narrow ravine. Trapped inside that ravine were more than 800 American infantrymen, cut off, isolated, staring down certain annihilation. A frantic rasp tore through Reynolds' headset. Asterisk abort. Return to base immediately. You are not cleared to engage. Asterisk, the order was absolute, the voice of high command demanding immediate obedience, demanding that he turn away from the bloodbath unfolding beneath his wings. But Jack barely registered the command. He heard only the silence of the impending slaughter. His lips moved, a silent oath echoing in the pressurized cabin. I'm not letting them die. He didn't hesitate. He jammed the nose down. The Thunderbolt shrieked, engines screaming as the sky turned into a blur of gray and blue. He was plummeting, executing a terrifying, gut-wrenching dive that defied every protocol. And in that desperate moment, the fate of the battlefield shifted. This wasn't the path of a decorated flyer. Jack Reynolds was the boy from the heartland, a speck of central Kansas prairie where the horizon met flatland and endless wheat fields. His father was a mechanic. His mother worked at the post office. He wasn't born into heroism. He was raised on hard work and humility. When he enlisted just weeks after Pearl Harbor, he had a boyish grin and a quiet voice. He sped through flight school, not because he was the best, but because the war was screaming for bodies in the air. In 1943, the dive bomber pilots in North Africa were suffering losses so horrifying that 1 out of every 3 never returned. Jack knew the odds. The older pilots had seen the Kansas boy arrive and smirked. "Hey, Kansas," when it called out, "You here to fly or to feed the cows?" He was deemed too green, relegated to low-risk reconnaissance. He flew formation, followed rules to the letter, but he felt the war pulling at him, a relentless moral gravity. He wasn't content to simply observe. He pushed command for bombing runs, to fly lead, only to be told, asterisk, not yet, Reynolds. You're too green. Asterisk. Sir, he had insisted once, I didn't come all this way just to circle the sky and come home. But command was firm. He would fly recon and observe only. And that is exactly what he was doing on April 3rd, 1943, the day everything changed. Now, anti-aircraft fire blossomed around him, tracers reaching up from the ground like spectral claws trying to tear the Thunderbolt apart. He was diving without clearance, without a single combat kill, and with barely 100 hours of flight time. The destiny of 800 trapped men rested entirely on the conviction of a 19-year-old farm boy, making a desperate, unauthorized gamble against the iron might of the Wehrmacht. They were men caught between the furnace of the desert and the iron fist of the enemy. It was early April 1943. The North African sun was a sadistic warden, baking the earth until it cracked like bone. Every breath was hot dust, every shadow a fleeting illusion. This was Tunisia, the campaign's brutal finale, where Field Marshal Rommel's veterans, though retreating, were determined to exact a crippling toll. Every hilltop, every choke point was a prepared killing field. That morning, the 45th Infantry Regiment was ordered into the jaws of the narrow valley west of the town of Manasai. It was stamped routine sweep. Light resistance expected, armor link up by sundown. They walked into the valley with confidence. They were walking into a grave. Unknown to Allied command, German scouts had watched their every move. A counter-ambush was already in motion. 3 companies of Panzer IV tanks, backed by veteran infantry and high-explosive artillery, had slipped like ghosts through pre-dawn hills, encircling the valley unseen. By high noon, the valley was sealed. The trap sprung with terrifying suddenness. The 45th was utterly boxed. Forward movement dissolved under the hammering impact of German tank fire. The rear escape path was gone, pulverized into an impassable ruin by precision shelling. Communications were shredded. Radio operators screamed into static, frantically cycling channels, desperate to find an ear in the deafening chaos. High above, in the sterile blue expanse, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds banked his P-47 Thunderbolt. He and his 5-plane squadron were tasked with a high-altitude reconnaissance pass along Route 12. The orders were glacial in their clarity. Asterisk observe. Maintain altitude. Do not engage. Asterisk for Reynolds. The war was supposed to be geometric lines and intelligence reports, not blood and desperation. But as Reynolds reached the target zone, the valley floor below began to churn. It wasn't the signature of a routine patrol. It was a storm. Great plumes of dust billowed from heavy tank treads. Ridge lines erupted in staccato bursts of orange light. Smoke. Thick, black pillars of desperation coiled upward. A shudder of dread ran through Reynolds. He flipped his radio switch, tuning away from the squadron's internal chatter. What flooded his headset wasn't a standard distress signal. It was pandemonium, a sickening chorus of overlapping terror. We're pinned down. Need immediate air support. Does anybody read? They're coming from the hills north and west. Then one voice cut through the noise, ragged and terrified. For God's sake, where's our cover? Reynolds knew that voice. It belonged to Private Earl McKinley, a kid from Alabama who, just weeks ago over stale coffee, had shown Reynolds a crinkled photo of his wife and newborn daughter. Now, that voice was unrecognizable, stripped raw by primal fear. The squadron leader's voice, cold and official, broke across the primary frequency. All units, pull west. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Return to base immediately. One after another, the thunderbolts obediently banked towards safety. Jack Reynolds remained fixed in the sky. Below him, the Panzer IVs were tightening the noose. The men of the 45th were trapped, cornered like prey in an abyss of clay and rock. There were no friendly spotters, no ground support, no salvation visible on the horizon. There was only the chaos below, the cold, distant voice of command, and Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, alone in the cockpit, wrestling with the impossible choice. The radio crackled, the static tasting of fear and pulverized rock. A desperate voice, crisp and formal despite the chaos erupting below, sliced through the network. Command! This is Lieutenant Reynolds. I am requesting immediate strike authorization. I have a visual on German armor, closing on friendly troops. Silence. A silence heavier than the shelling. Then the icy reply, Negative, Reynolds. You are not cleared. Return to base. But the secondary channel was a torrent of raw sound. A scream of pure terror tore through the headset of Lieutenant Carl Hartman, pinned down in the ravished terrain of Mordheim. We're getting slaughtered down here. Where the hell's our air? Hartman didn't need to look at Gunner Earl Bishop or Loader James Ortega to feel their desperation. Every pound of fuel, every pound of ordnance, felt like a choice between survival and following an impossible order. The stakes were not just a man in the mud, but the defense of Avranches itself, the ultimate objective of Operation Luttich. Reynolds glanced at his gauges. Fuel was halfway. He had 2,000 pounds of ordnance, a ton of fate, 1,000 pounds tucked under each wing. He had trained for this moment, drilled the angle of attack, the perfect release speed, the last-second, bone-jarring pullout. He looked left. His wingman, Lieutenant Connors, held the prescribed formation. Reynolds' voice, stripped of all doubt, cut through the intercom. Connors, I'm going in. What? Connors' shout was frantic. Jack, you heard the order. This is suicide. You'll face a court-martial. Reynolds didn't reply. He broke formation, slamming the stick forward. The P-47 Thunderbolt nosed down, diving straight into firestorm boiling up from a valley floor. Connors screamed after him, the sound rising into panic. Reynolds, pull up. You'll get torn apart down there. But Jack was already accelerating. The wind shrieked louder than the radio. Flak bursts erupted around the aircraft in fat, venomous black puffs. The sky became a cage of exploding steel. The plane shuddered violently. A deafening crack. The left wing took a hit, but held. At 5,000 feet, he wrenched the die brakes open. At 3,000 feet, he lined up his sights. Below, the German panzers were clustered at the mouth of the ravine, a metallic tide ready to roll in for the kill. Driver Tony Vitelli flinched inside the Sherman as the German cannon fire intensified, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to defend their position. At 1,500 feet, Reynolds armed the bombs. His hands were steady now, his heartbeat slowed. He whispered a single name, *Earl*, for Earl Bishop, for George Marks, for all the mud-caked infantrymen facing extinction. At 900 feet, he released. Both bombs dropped clean. He hauled the yoke back with everything he had, muscles straining, the incredible G-forces flattening his vision. The ground rushed toward him like a gray concrete wall. Then came the fire, a blinding white flash, followed by a concussive blast that deafened the world. He was airborne barely. He didn't look back, but Lieutenant Hartman and his crew did. So did the terrified infantrymen, who moments before had been staring death in the face. What they saw would be etched in their memory for life. A lone dive bomber, descending like a vengeful comet, punching a smoking, ruined hole in the German line. A miracle wrought by a madman. For several seconds after the blast, only silence remained. No one moved in the ravaged foxholes. Men blinked up at the sky, stunned by the sudden absence of violence. Where moments before armored steel had marched toward them, there was now only smoke, fire, and wreckage. The lead panzer had vanished in a plume of oil and flame. The tank directly behind it had been flipped onto its side, tread spinning uselessly. The rest of the column stalled in complete confusion, paralyzed by the audacity of the attack. In the cockpit, however, the moment was anything but divine. Jack Reynolds was fighting for his life. The blast had rocked his aircraft like a child's toy. His left wing flaps were half shredded, the engine cowling smoking violently. The cockpit was rattling like a box of nails in a tumble dryer. Alarms blared insistently. His throttle response was delayed. His controls felt thick as if wrapped in molasses, but the Sherman tank, ironclad, was deafening. Inside the turret, Lieutenant Carl Hartman felt the concussion of the main gun reverberate deep in his chest. They were too low, too fast, a steel specter tearing to the shattered bocage. He could practically smell the burning oil on the uniforms of the infantrymen as they passed, young, dirty, wide-eyed, yet suddenly vividly alive. Tony Vitelli, the driver, wrestled the controls, fighting to maintain speed as they burst onto the open ground above the ravine. As they cleared the dense tree line, Lieutenant Hartman saw the catastrophic effect of their unauthorized sprint. The German spearhead, the vanguard of Operation Luttich, was in chaos. 3 disabled Panther tanks choked the critical ravine, turning the natural choke point into a metallic graveyard. Infantry units, stripped of their armored escort, were scattering wildly, convinced an entire division was about to roll over them. But there was no division. There was only the ironclad. Back at the divisional command post, the radio net was a maelstrom of confusion and recrimination. Lieutenant Hartman's reckless breach of protocol was known. The colonel was already drafting the paperwork for a court-martial, furious over the likely loss of a tank and its crew. Then came the impossible, a crackling report from the 45th Regiment's forward observer, his voice hoarse with shock and relief. The armor column is hit. We are holding position. Enemy advance stalled at Mortain. I repeat, the advance on Avranches is stalled. That one tank bought us hours. Another voice, ragged with adrenaline, cut through the static. We saw it, sir. 1 Sherman, 1 charge. They took out the lead column, saved the whole damn regiment. I don't know who was in that crew, but they are heroes tonight. The ironclad was shuddering toward collapse. The transmission groaned, and the engine was sputtering a death rattle. The oil pressure gauge was dropping precariously low. Lieutenant Hartman talked to the machine like it was a stubborn mule. Come on, girl. Just a little farther. Don't quit on me now. and Earl Bishop and Loader James Ortega sat slumped against the walls, exhausted but alert, ready to man the breach if the track finally blew. When they finally limped back into the American perimeter, ground crews swarmed the smoking hulk, hoses ready to spray down the engine before the heat ignited the fuel. Lieutenant Hartman hauled himself out, legs trembling, his face blackened by soot. His commanding officer materialized from the shadows, eyes blazing. "What the hell were you thinking, Lieutenant?" The officer barked, his voice tight with controlled rage. "You disobeyed orders. You endangered your crew. You committed an act of gross insubordination that warrants immediate disciplinary action." Lieutenant Hartman said nothing. Before the tirade could continue, a young corporal ran up, clutching a field radio. "Sir, urgent message from the 45th. Command is confirming the German retreat from the ravine." He paused, struggling to catch his breath. "They are crediting Lieutenant Hartman S-Tank. He saved the 45th, sir. Operation Luttich failed to break through Mortain because of this action." The colonel froze, the fury draining from his face, replaced by a terrible, stark silence. Lieutenant Hartman finally spoke, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "We heard them on the secondary channel. Sir, they were dying down there. Driver Tony Vitelli and the others agreed. We couldn't leave them." The colonel stared at the young lieutenant for what felt like an eternity, then turned sharply and walked away without another word. That night, Lieutenant Hartman sat outside the hangar, still in his soiled uniform, beginning the long, meticulous process of writing the mandatory AR. Lieutenant Carl Hartman slumped against the scorched glassy plate of his Sherman, the acrid scent of spent cordite thick in the damp August air near Mortain. He felt no triumph. His hands still shook violently. The ringing silence that followed the close-quarters engagements of the night before was almost worse than the battle itself. He had done the only thing that kept him breathing, the only thing that saved the hundreds of broken infantrymen surrounding them. Yet, a cold dread of consequence was heavy on his chest. He was no longer just a tank commander. He was a man who had abandoned the fire support line and charged headlong into the throat of Operation Luttich. Was he a savior, or simply a fool who got lucky? By dawn, the rumors sweeping the sector were sharp and divisive. The field officers demanded discipline. Lieutenant Hartman was finished. They whispered, risking the tank, the lives of Gunner Earl Bishop, loader James Ortega, and driver Tony Vitelli, an entire operational success of the defense of Mortain to carry out an unauthorized, desperate gamble. It was the very definition of behavior demanding a court-martial. They claimed the tank should have been vaporized mid-assault, that he had no business making that impossible call. But the mud-caked infantrymen, the ones who had been drowning under the German weight until Hartman broke the assault, told a different story. They wished they had the sheer, reckless guts to follow him. That same morning, the formal report arrived. The typed AR was chillingly clinical. At 0300 hours on August 7th, one enemy armor column, spearheading the thrust of Operation Luttich and consisting of no fewer than 13 German armored vehicles, including Panzer IVs and accompanying mechanized infantry, was decisively halted in its assault toward Avranches. The halt was achieved due to an unauthorized, highly aggressive counterattack by an unidentified American tank unit. The result was undeniable. An estimated 500 U.S. infantrymen were able to consolidate and retreat to defensible ground. Reinforcements arrived within the hour. Total German casualties were 39 killed, including one armor company commander, and the entire momentum of the breakthrough was shattered. The AR did not name Lieutenant Carl Hartman, but by that evening, everyone knew. In the crowded field mess, men stood when he entered, not with applause, but with a quiet, profound respect, the way soldiers acknowledge a rarity of courage. Hartman picked up his tray, trying desperately not to meet their eyes, still bracing for the inevitable. He hadn't spoken to his commanding officer since the sun came up, and he expected, at best, a formal reprimand. At worst, a career-ending judgment. He was called to the command tent late that night. He stood at attention, shoulders back. The colonel sat behind a folding desk, watching him for a full minute. "You disobeyed a direct order, Lieutenant Hartman," he said, the words flat and cold. "Yes, sir. You risked your men, your machine, and the operational integrity of this entire sector." "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned back, his eyes unwavering. "And in doing so, Lieutenant, you saved a regiment and ensured the defense of Mortain." Hartman remained silent. This war doesn't need reckless cowboys, the colonel continued. It needs discipline. It needs men who follow orders even when the consequences are painful. I understand, sir. The colonel rose slowly, walking around the desk. But it also needs men who see the impossible line. And, God help us, sometimes it needs men who break every rule in the book to save lives. He handed Hartman a piece of paper. Effective immediately, you are recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Hartman blinked, staring at the citation. You, the colonel added sternly, are also restricted to base for 7 days. Your duties will include ensuring that Major George Marks's Jeep is spotless. Understood, sir. The senior officer nodded slowly. Good. Now, go get some rest, Lieutenant. We'll need you back in the air soon. Because of your action, the road to Avranches is still open. Word spread like a shockwave through the ground, an air unit stationed near Mortine. Lieutenant Carl Hartman, the disciplined pilot everyone pegged as a rule follower, was now the one recommended for commendation, and simultaneously, pending a comprehensive AR of his unauthorized deviation. He didn't seek the notoriety. When pressed about his rogue bombing run, he would only say, I saw what was happening. Someone had to do something. But the truth was a cold, hard fact he carried in his gut. Lieutenant Hartman hadn't acted on impulse. He had calculated the cost. His career as potential court-martial against the lives of the trapped infantry. He knew the risk. And still, he went in. In the chaotic weeks that followed, as the Wehrmacht clawed back ground during the ferocity of Operation Luttich, other pilots began flying lower, getting braver. They had seen what was possible when one man trusted his judgment over a radioed protocol. Command noticed a shift. While official orders remained stringent, more discretion was quietly allocated to experienced pilots. Use your judgment, Lieutenant, became the whispered, unofficial mantra. Carl Hartman flew 32 more harrowing missions over the contested French countryside. He never broke formation again, not because he was afraid of censure, but because he never had to. His squadron, bolstered by pilots like Captain George Marks, followed him willingly. When Lieutenant Hartman gave a command, they listened because they knew that the farm boy from Kansas had already proven everything that mattered beneath the canopy of the European sky. He had looked death in the face and dove straight into it. Not for glory, not for medals, but for the men on the ground. For Gunner Earl Bishop, for loader James Ortega, for driver Tony Vitelli, for the voices on the other end of the static choke radio who thought no one was coming to save them. In private halls, the brass still debated his actions. Some insisted he got lucky. If his ordnance had missed, the entire flanking maneuver could have been wiped out. Bravery without authorization, they argued, still demanded a court-martial. But others countered with a grim reality. In war, you don't always get time to ask permission. It is sometimes better to act and be punished than to wait and be too late. And the men whose lives he saved, they cared nothing for the chain of command. They didn't care about flight regulations or strategic protocols. All they remembered was the savage sound of that engine screaming overhead, the flash of fire that engulfed the German panzers, and the sudden, overwhelming knowledge that someone, somewhere, had chosen to risk everything to save them. They never forgot that. Years later, one of the survivors, by then an old man with trembling hands, was asked about the day he nearly died near Mortine. He looked up, his eyes glassy and distant. We thought we were dead, he said, his voice a rasp. Then out of nowhere, this plane comes down like an angel falling out of heaven. One lieutenant, one plane. He changed everything. And that is how legends are born, not in the halls of power or the neat pages of reports, but in the memory of the men whose lives hung by a thread and were saved by a pilot who refused to let go. The bigger picture, the eternal, necessary argument of courage versus discipline. Long after Lieutenant Carl Hartman's bombing run became legendary among the men of the ground forces, his story echoed through the broader ranks of the United States Army Air Forces. Some heard it with admiration, others with profound discomfort, but everyone heard it. It sparked a quiet argument, one that still had no easy answer. What matters more in a crisis? War obedience or primal instinct? By the spring of 1943, the doctrine of American command remained rigid, a blueprint rooted in uncompromising hierarchy. Orders were sacrosanct. To question them was to invite chaos, insubordination, and potentially a formal court-martial. Disciplined units survived. Undisciplined units collapsed under pressure, sacrificing not just themselves, but the mission. And yet, war itself was the ultimate form of chaos. The ground war, the grinding, bloody reality, changed faster than any order could be scribbled onto a communique. From the scorched earth of Tunisia to the brutal mountain passes of Italy, men were constantly forced into moments that no field manual could possibly predict. The unauthorized solo dive executed by the pilot known as Jack crystallized this tension. On the page, what he did was a grievous tactical offense. On the battlefield, it was a stroke of genius that saved the line. When the AAR after-action reports reached headquarters, command officers were deeply divided. The official recommendation for the Silver Star lauded Jack's action, describing it as exceptional bravery under extreme pressure and instrumental in halting enemy advancement. But the bureaucratic armor was thick. Tucked into fine print was a phrase meant to serve as a stark warning, asterisk, despite deviation from standard air engagement protocol. Asterisk, that caveat was no accident. It was a command structure drawing a line in the sand, attempting to define Jack's success as a statistical miracle, not a new standard. But the men on the ground, the pilots cramped into tents near the front, didn't read the memos. They read the outcome. Jack was not a flamboyant flyer. He barely spoke of the incident. He didn't posture or revel in the glory. That stark humility made his defiance resonate even louder. Veteran Captain Lauren Hawk, Hawthorne voice of consensus. Every war has its hotshots, guys who fly hot break rules and get people killed. Jack wasn't one of them. He knew exactly what he was risking, and he did it anyway, not for himself, but for the boys sweating blood on the ground. Statistically, a solo dive bombing run was military folly. High risk, catastrophic potential. The margin for error. The precious seconds to drop ordnance accurately while pulling out safely from the torrent of ground fire was impossibly slim. Most such runs ended in failure or worse. But when they worked, they cracked the enemy backbone. Dive bombing became a brutal, specialized instrument of American air tactics, perfected by the introduction of the tough Douglas SBD Dauntless and a legendary Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. These aircraft were designed to absorb punishment, but no metal shell was invincible. The dive placed the pilot in the most exposed position possible, low, slow, and directly in the crosshairs. Training dictated avoidance. Yet Jack had plunged downward, driven by raw instinct and necessity. His success quietly opened a door, not in official policy, but in the rigid minds of commanders. The language of orders began to shift. They became flexible, not lax, but open-ended. Command started including revolutionary phrases. Use your best judgment. Asterisk, react based on field conditions. Asterisk, it was an unspoken, unofficial nod to men like Jack. A recognition that in the cauldron of combat, in the desperate scramble to defend Mortain and halt the German drive toward Avranches during Operation Luttich, intuition could be the most powerful weapon of all. Reynolds, his action fractured the sterile geometry of command. The war demanded more than machines and maps. It demanded human calculus, moral conviction. Jack's subsequent court-martial became a cold, whispered precedent. Other pilots absorbed the lesson. Not recklessness, but conviction. They trained harder, analyzing every contour of the French countryside, preparing for that impossible moment of choice. And those moments came. In the grinding confusion of Italy, a fighter pilot shattered formation to destroy a rail bridge deep in enemy territory, a target unknown to high command, later revealed as a vital supply choke point for a desperate German retreat. Later, during the chaos surrounding Operation Luttich near Mortain, a bomber crew rerouted to evade a planned trap and stumbled upon the hidden steel column of a panzer convoy, destroying it before it could ever reinforce the thrust toward Avranches. None of these acts ever carried the official stamp of Jack Reynolds' influence in any formal AR. Yet, the men who flew those sorties all knew his name. Long after surrender, long after North African France faded into history books, Jack's name echoed through veteran halls and dusty reunion letters. He became the definition of the impossible, Not a myth, not a cautionary tale, but a symbol. The point where the rigid spine of military obedience met the flexible, beating heart of human courage, and bent just enough to save lives. Decades later, interviewed as an old man, his face sun-worn and lined, Reynolds offered no grand defense. "I didn't do anything special," he stated simply. "I just saw men in trouble, and I was the only one up there who could do something about it." That humility was a final, devastating lesson. Courage was never about the medal count or the headline. It was about performing the right action when the cost was steepest, when no one else would look. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a mirror held up to every soldier facing the firing line of morality. Follow the order or follow your gut. Risk a court-martial or risk mass death. Sometimes, in the middle of the worst kind of war, the best kind of man makes the hardest kind of decision and lives with it. Down below, in the blinding dust of Tunisia, the men he saved barely had time to register their reprieve. 1 second, they were preparing to make peace with a certain arrival of death. The next, the crushing pressure simply evaporated. Wide-eyed and disbelieving, they saw the smoke bloom from the lead German armor, precise, overwhelming fury delivered by a solitary machine. In the shockwave of combat, details are fleeting. They never learned his name. They never saw his face. All they experienced was that silver streak hurtling from the searing sky, the flash of bombs, and the sudden, profound silence that followed. That silence was life. For the hundreds scrambling to reform and regroup, that impossible, unauthorized maneuver bought them the time they needed to survive. Even in the immediate, blinding chaos of Operation Luttich, the men fighting to hold Mortain against the spearhead thrust toward Avron struggled to comprehend what they had just witnessed. It felt less like warfare and more like an act of divine intervention. Gunner Earl Bishop, his face smeared with grease and fear, peered out from the hull of his Sherman. He was the first to speak, the desperation in his voice echoing the radio chatter moments earlier. Did God just drop that bomb? For days afterward, the AARs poured in, attempting to rationalize the impossible strike. Engineers and intelligence officers confirmed the target's significance. The leading German tank was an improvised mobile command post, carrying encrypted radios, critical maps, and the company commander himself. Its destruction, total and instantaneous, left the entire German column instantly deaf-blind and leaderless. That crucial window of silence, created by one pilot's impossible maneuver, was all the time Lieutenant Carl Hartmann's unit needed for American reinforcements to flood the line. That impossible moment changed everything. Decades later, the sand of the initial campaigns, the orders, the names of the generals, all faded into historical footnotes. But the men never forgot the dive. At reunions, veterans, including driver Tony Vitelli and loader James Ortega, would sit around fires, the smoke carrying the memory of cordite. They would talk about the pilot, who came out of nowhere. One man, perhaps George Marks, would always recount the feeling. He was one of ours, diving like he wanted to kiss the ground. Then boom, it was like the sky answered us. They vowed that if they ever met him, they would buy him every drink he could handle. In the quiet years after the fighting ceased, letters began to arrive. Men tracked down the pilot, not for glory, but for gratitude. They didn't ask for recognition. They just wanted to express the truth. You saved my life. The man they searched for, the hero who never faced a court-martial for his reckless courage, never chased fanfare. He settled in the Pacific Northwest, married, and became a flight instructor, teaching hundreds of young men how to read the skies. He never spoke much about the fury of Operation Luttich or his Silver Star. When asked the secret to good flying, he always gave the same understated reply. Someone who knows when to pull the trigger and when not to. But Lieutenant Carl Hartmann and his crew knew the deeper, starker truth. That pilot wasn't just teaching men how to fly safely. He was teaching them the weight of decision. Because in the crucible of Mortain, when every rule in the book demanded self-preservation, that man had made a solitary, impossible choice. And that choice had given Lieutenant Carl Hartmann, Gunner Earl Bishop, James Ortega, and Tony Vitelli the gift of the future. It was a defiant stand that cost them everything, yet gifted a generation their future. And in the end, perhaps that is the truest measure of a legacy. Not how loudly it is commemorated, but how profoundly it is felt by those who never forgot the fire they survived. Tony Vitelli, the driver, passed away quietly in the spring of 2004. He was 81 years old. The obituary, a simple column in the Ohio paper, spoke of his service in World War II, his years building homes, his love for his grandkids, and the family he left behind. It didn't mention the impossible choice near Mortain. It didn't mention the shattered track or the final radio silence. It didn't need to. Those who were there already knew. At his graveside service, two men stood vigil, their backs stiffened by decades of memory. They were Earl Bishop, the gunner, and James Ortega, the loader. Bishop, leaning heavily on a cane, held a faded envelope to his chest. Ortega, silent, placed a small, tarnished piece of shrapnel on the casket. Later, Bishop handed the envelope to Tony's surviving daughter. On the outside, written in Carl Hartman's neat script from 1944, were just 5 words, *Mortain, August 7th. Thank you, *. Inside was a copy of the final entry Lieutenant Carl Hartman had dictated for the AR, later recovered from a damaged field archive. If we don't make it, tell command I'd rather face a court-martial for saving Avranches than receive a medal for following orders that surrendered it. It was not poetry. It was harsh, unvarnished testimony. But in that quiet, desperate defiance, it held the weight of every soldier who ever stood at the crossroads of duty and sheer necessity. That sentence, written by a young tank commander confronting the full fury of Operation Luttich, now lives on as his final testament. Because the truth is, wars are made up of moments, not grand strategy or sweeping political rhetoric, but small, sharp decisions made in seconds with no guarantee of survival. A loader shoves a final shell into breach when the turret is engulfed in smoke. A driver slams a transmission into reverse under murderous fire. A lieutenant, ordered to retreat and save his tank, chooses instead to fight on, knowing that his 3-man crew, Earl Bishop, James Ortega, and Tony Vitelli, will follow him straight into the mouth of the Panzer Division commanded by George Marks. Most of those moments are lost to the history books, but not this one. This one left a permanent scar, not just in medals or commendations, but in lives. Real breathing lives who were able to hold the line until reinforcements arrived, because Lieutenant Hartman chose to act when no one else would. Lieutenant Hartman did not survive the fighting near Mortain, but he risked everything so that the wider line could hold, and that risk became his legacy. It was a legacy not built in statues or textbooks, but in the hearts of the men who saw his command tank explode in a fiery curtain that bought the time the American advance needed. In that catastrophic decision, Lieutenant Hartman became more than a commander. He became a reminder. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to lead the charge anyway. That rules matter, but sometimes conscience matters more. And that sometimes, in the utter fog of war, the clearest vision belongs to the one who dares to see past immediate orders and follow the desperate need of the moment. So, if you remember nothing else about this story, remember this. A young lieutenant, trapped with his tank and 3 crewmen, Bishop, Ortega, and Vitelli, stared down the German spearhead of Operation Luttich and chose instead to dive toward danger, not for glory, not for fame, but because it was the only thing that could prevent the fall of Avranches. And hundreds of men lived because of it. What shocked you most? The defiance, the sacrifice, or the lasting impact of that impossible stand?